Welcome everyone to our third episode of our series on Don Quixote. Today we're examining chapter 2, in which Don Quixote goes on his first sally as a knight errant. Today, of course, we have with us Kia and Tudor, who will help us uh, examine this chapter in depth. Kia, would you provide us with a synopsis of exactly what actually happens in this chapter? It's a pretty short chapter, actually.
Yeah, super short. So yeah, he's kind of finished with all of his preparations before he's ready to leave his La Mancha, his hometown, and he's tired of waiting, so he goes off on his journey. And then, like shortly after he's gone on his journey, he's um, quite quite disturbed by the fact that he hasn't actually been knighted, and so he kind of thinks about this for a little bit and then determines that the first knight that he sees, he's gonna make sure that he gets knighted by that person. And kind of goes onto the journey, ends up at an inn, and he meets these two ladies in his mind, like noble women, but it seems to be the case that that's not really what they are at all. And they, like everyone he kind of encounters at the inn, thinks he's quite humorous, but then they kind of offer him refreshments and offer Rossignante refreshments as well. And then I think they offer him food. Is it in this chapter where he gets told that he needs to have money, or is that in chapter 3?
I think that's chapter 3. Yeah, yeah. It's
Okay.
it's surprisingly short. Like even when I was rereading it, I was bringing into it in my memory a whole series of events that take place later. Because this section where he's at the inn is quite. It's in the story. It takes place over 2 or 3 chapters even. But yeah, it's all
Yeah.
the whole the ceremony, the stoning, etc., and all that takes place in the next chapter, and even potentially the chapter after that. No, excellent. Thank you
Mm.
very much. That's a very succinct synopsis. That encompasses everything important in this chapter. Tudor, what were your thoughts about this chapter?
Um, I think what's interesting about this chapter is that it's sort of like Don Quixote is waiting to become a knight, because in a way, his belief or his perception of himself as a knight is dependent on everyone around him knowing that he's a knight. So what's interesting is that he's sort of waiting for this moment where he can become known, where he can have renown, but he doesn't find the kinds of people that can give him that title. So what's interesting is that he then ends up giving people titles that don't really belong to them, right? So like with the women who are like making deliveries, he's turned them into like noble ladies waiting outside of a castle. He transforms the inn that he goes to as a castle, and sort of like the innkeeper as the caretaker of the castle that he's now being welcomed with. And I think also there's a point where there's someone who's herding some animals, and in a way he's waiting to have this announcement that he as a knight is arriving at this castle, which is actually an inn, and he's waiting for the announcement that this knight has arrived. But then it's actually just the sound of the person herding the animals, and he's busy trying to make sound to get them in order. But now in Don Quixote's mind, it's like an announcement that he's arrived. So it's interesting because it's sort of like the belief he needs people to believe he's a knight, but then what ends up happening is he's the one that has to believe people are greater things than they actually are. Yeah.
That I think that's actually very insightful. I never thought of it. Actually, I haven't thought of Don Quixote through that lens either. But because we know that commentators have pointed out how these first two chapters are, they describe this process of self-creation. So we spoke almost about the very heavy Genesis overtones to chapter 1, where he sort of names himself. You see this, then he names, he of course invents Dulcinea del Toboso and Rocinante. And so there's this kind of almost fractal of Adam, of, you know, the creation of Adam, Eve, and then animals, but then also Adam naming the animals. And it seems very, it's it seems very deliberate from on Cervantes' part to write it in such a way. But at the same time, and so while this process of self-creation is really important in these first two chapters, the point that you're making there is that self-creation can't be purely individualistic. It actually it relies in large part on other people in some sense cooperating in this. And I think now that you mention this, it's a useful lens to analyze the characters that come up, both in the first part, but especially in the second part, because there are certain there are certain there's a certain added importance in the second part. It's useful to analyze all these characters according to, do they kind of facilitate Don Quixote's folly, or do they try and oppose it? And people can kind of be fit into these two categories. And I mean, this touches on points that Kia made earlier, about them feeding Don Quixote. It's actually, this chapter makes for some fairly it's slightly uncomfortable viewing, or reading. I say viewing because there's a very good adaptation that Spanish national TV did a while back. I think of both. It might even be of both parts, but certainly of the first part. And this chapter is actually, it's really hard to watch how Don Quixote is being humiliated by these people who are kind of, they're mocking him by buying into his excessive imagination. Um, that's one way of reading it. I've always found this, actually, it feels like they're being really cruel to this old man, you know. But I suppose also that, I suppose this touches partially upon what Tudor says is, I mean, if you were hypothetically in such a situation, what do, right? Do you kind of play it? Do you try and be quote unquote polite and pretend that this man is actually a knight? Because doing so may actually only kind of make him look more stupid. Or do you try and do the rough thing, be the bad guy, and say, look, you're not a knight. There haven't been knights for the last 100 years in Spain. Um, so I think that's social, like the social dynamic of it. I never gave much thought to it, but you're quite right there. I think that's actually a really interesting, that's a very interesting point. And I think maybe we can use this as a chance for me to jump into the very first part, because there's a clear division in this first chapter. The first part of the chapter is Don Quixote in the wilderness. And then the second is Don Quixote in society. So what we see is also, perhaps this reflects kind of almost a history of human development, right? So there's almost creation of man, woman, animals. And then you've got this kind of completely unsettled life, right? Don Quixote is living entirely in the wild. And then he encounters the inn, and that might also be representative of early civilization. That, I think, that could be quite an interesting reading of it. Maybe the one point I want to make, this first section where Don Quixote is out in the wild west, so he sallies forth. He's kind of done all of his mental preparation, as you alluded to earlier, Kia, and he goes straight out into the wilderness. And the first thing he notices is, firstly, the lack of society. So um, for me, this evokes some of those ideas, like in ideas that are in Aristotle, but I think also in Hobbes as well, that man is a social animal, and kind of we can't exist unless we have other, unless we exist in human society. It's not really possible for us to thrive, and also it's very difficult for us to survive without without society. And so he immediately realizes that this lack of society in the Castilian plains uh, is hindering him from carrying out what he sees as his destiny. In this first part, what is there anything you'd like to comment on there, Kia?
I hadn't really thought of it in like in the way that you described, but I think it is really interesting because he does kind of say like he's wasting time because there's no one to save, and there's this really grandiose feeling of what he's meant to do. So I think that's very interesting. But I hadn't actually, yeah, there's lots of interesting things you've said. I don't know if I have anything that insightful yet, but
I'm sure
yeah.
they will come in time. Something I'll mention before I hand over to Tudor and ask his questions about this section uh, is, of course, I mentioned in our introductory session, that was a few months back already, how a famous um, a famous theorist of literature who has a popular YouTube channel. His name is Jesus G. Maestro, and I think he's a lecturer at the University of Oviedo. I can't remember, but in one of his lectures, he makes on Don Quixote. He makes a statement that I've come to understand somewhat, which is that if all of the world's literature were destroyed in some cataclysm and Don Quixote alone remained, we'd be able to recreate all of world literature through Don Quixote, at least all Western literature through Don Quixote. And what Maestro is referring to here is that Cervantes, when he wrote Don Quixote, set about making this one work that would incorporate all genres. And we see in this first segment, the kind of what we might want to call the wilderness segment, maybe the Castilian plain segment, if we want to be a bit innovative here. We see we see at least two genres pop up. So the one is the pastoral romance, and I'd like to read a quote from there because the prose is actually very beautiful in Spanish. And then the second is also the chivalric romance. So, and actually, in fact, there's a third. There's an inkling, hint of a third, which is history. So we actually see in that segment there are references, allusions to three different kind of genres, and I thought that was quite interesting. Something I didn't notice the first time I read this. Tudor, do you have any thoughts on this segment? Anything to add to what I've said?
Yeah, I think it seems a bit interesting as well that he left. Now that I'm looking back at it, he left without telling anyone. But then, like you say, then he sets out alone, sort of like in this wilderness, and then he realizes he actually needs people in order to earn his knighthood through his
Yeah,
actions.
yeah, precisely. There's so much that's coming up now that I seriously never thought of before. So what I'd maybe like
But
to do
he sets
here
out
is,
alone.
yes, exactly. He sets out alone. That's actually a very good point. So he doesn't even, it's interesting that he doesn't even seem to try and convince the people in his own household to to humor him. I mean, he wouldn't obviously have put it in those terms, but it's interesting that he doesn't ask them to sort of participate in this world he's creating for himself. I wonder if that's an indication that he's at some level conscious that that he's actually dreaming up a folly. Because this isn't that's a point that readers have made over the years, is that it's not entirely clear that Don Quixote is actually completely unaware. Like it's not. I don't have access to the sort of psychological terminology I'd need here, but it's not entirely clear that he's completely persuaded by his seeming belief that he's actually a knight, that he actually should be a knight. Um, and in fact, when you think about it, even his as 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 crazy as he comes to seem in the upcoming chapters, when when he formulates his plan, it actually seems quite reasonable, right? he never says that knights still exist. What he says is he wants to bring back the code of chivalry. He wants to bring back the world of the chivalric romance. So that's also kind of interesting as well. There's lots of evidence in the first chapter that he actually does go mad. There's that famous line in I don't know how Ormsby translates it, but it's se le secó el cerebro. So literally, his brain dried out from reading so much of this literature. And so while there are some almost explicit, there are some explicit claims that he has actually gone mad. The fact that he doesn't tell anyone in his household about his ideas seems to indicate that he knows that they won't believe him, and he knows, or rather, he knows that they will think of him as being mad. And so there's this kind of self-awareness actually that is very interesting, and this becomes very interesting because I think it's a self-awareness that if we pay close attention to, might disappear over the course of the first part. So you might, in a sense, kind of like by enacting this fictional world, he actually starts to believe in it more and more. You know, there's this idea of be very careful who you pretend to be, because over time you might actually become that person. So that's actually an interesting point. I don't know if you have something you want to mention about that, Kia.
Yeah, I think that there's like this interesting thing about like, does he know and doesn't he know? Because like earlier on you were saying like looking at it and watching it makes you feel quite sorry for him. But I think there's like something quite, I find it almost beautiful that there's this such a strong compulsion to like make the world look make the world right in your own eyes. That no matter what comes your way, you'll translate it into the world made right. And of course it's delusional, but like the one example I think was he wants trout, and then they give him troutlets, and then he says, well, if there's enough troutlets, surely it's the same as one trout.
Yeah.
And that also seeming like a sign of self-awareness, like making these accommodations in the world in every way it doesn't match up, to still mean like, well, it's okay, I'm still a knight kind of thing.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know.
No, I agree with you. I think throughout the story, he's a very interesting character because he's at times frustrating. He's actually a bit irritating at times. He's very moving. He's very his insistence on trying to see the world as it best could be is very moving and very inspiring in many ways. Um, his nobility in that sense is actually something that remains throughout the books, and in fact it continues as the story goes on. The final chapters of the story are extremely sad. They're very beautiful and very, very sad. We'll get there eventually, but we it's actually remarkable how psychologically complex a character he is. Um, he's at times, because even within the space of a chapter, he's someone you admire, and he's someone you pity. He's also someone you get quite frustrated and irritated with as well. So, and this, as we said, this is all in the space of a very, very short chapter. There are some points I want to make when we discuss the his encounter with the inn. Uh, but yes, so maybe what I'd like to do is I'd like to read this really beautiful part in Spanish if we can, because it gives you kind of an idea of really just the beauty of the prose. It's a fairly long segment, but this is when he sallies forth, and so he roams about the Castilian plains for a while, and Castile is maybe our international audience won't really get this reference as much. But Castile is actually a lot like the High Veld. I think I've mentioned that beforehand. So it's very dry. Um, its summers are dry and hot. There's very little humidity. You can almost imagine that kind of High Veld, that grass that's essentially straw in color and in texture as well. And him roaming through these plains as well. In fact, Cervantes writes somewhere here how here it is in Spanish. He says, "Una mañana antes del día que era uno de los calurosos del mes de julio." So one morning before the day, which was one of the warm days in the month of July. And you see later, it's a Friday as well. So there's the specificity to this chapter and to the start of the book. We know it's his first sally is on a Friday in June. So that narrows it down to one of 4 Fridays that year. And then, so he, of course, sallies forth, and then he waxes lyrical about what he's doing. And this actually ties into what I was talking about, the genre blending nature of it. So I'll read very quickly what he says, and I'll give you a very rough translation. ¿Quién duda sino que en los venideros tiempos, cuando salga a luz la verdadera historia de mis famosos hechos, que el sabio que los escribiere no ponga, cuando llegue a contar esta mi primera salida tan de mañana, de esta manera? Apenas había el rubicundo Apolo tendido por la faz de la ancha y espaciosa tierra las doradas hebras de sus hermosos cabellos, y apenas los pequeños y pintados pajarillos con sus arpadas lenguas habían saludado con dulce y meliflua armonía la venida de la rosada aurora, que, dejando la blanda cama del celoso marido, por las puertas y balcones del manchego horizonte a los mortales se mostraba, cuando el famoso caballero Don Quijote de la Mancha, dejando las ociosas plumas, subió sobre su famoso caballo rocinante y comenzó a caminar por el antiguo y conocido campo de Montiel. And what I love about this segment is that the Spanish is very beautiful, actually. Cervantes is writing in an extremely, what would the word be? In this extremely engrossing style. What I find so fascinating about Don Quixote and about so much of the literature of this period as well is that the current idea that we have that something that is comedic is in some sense of lower value than something quote unquote serious, right? So we would sometimes struggle to see something comedic as being something beautiful. A comedy, when you go out and watch a comedy in cinema, by and large, it's something that we would more consider a pastime. We wouldn't consider it as something culturally enriching. Of course, at the time that Cervantes was writing this wasn't at all the case, right? Literature was divided into tragedy and comedy. Cervantes' contemporary and rival, actually, Lope de Vega, famously fused those two in his so-called tragicomedia. But there was this idea that something could be quote unquote seriously funny, right? Humor did not exclude something from being beautiful and informative and edifying, and this comes across in this part as well. It's ridiculous in a way. Don Quixote is riding out there, and he's saying, if I were to provide an inadequate translation, who doubts, but that in coming times, that in times to come, when the true history of my famous deeds comes to light, that the wise man who writes them won't place, when he comes to account my first sally, so early in the morning. And then he goes on in words. Hardly had blonde Apollo. Perhaps I can't really give this an adequate translation, but he basically talks. He eulogizes the sun. So he says, hardly had blonde Apollo, had the locks of blonde Apollo spread across the plains, and he's obviously Apollo is a metaphor for the sun here, or more rather a symbol for the sun here, and his locks being the rays of the sun. And he goes on to talk about how the small colorful birds with their song had greeted, with harmony, had greeted the rosy dawn, rosy fingered dawn. Of course, that actually comes from the Iliad. I think rosy fingered dawn is one of those. I can't remember what the particular term is, but it's one of those sort of set phrases that's used often in the Iliad and actually in oral tradition in general, stock phrases. And yeah, it's actually very beautiful, but it's also ridiculous at the same time. And Cervantes' way of kind of like blending the profound with the ridiculous is something I find amazing. I think it makes you think a little bit about the sort of this general postmodernist attempt to kind of eliminate the distinction between high culture and low culture. That was very kind of set in modernist thought. Um, well, in this sense, Cervantes has shown himself the um, the postmodernist par excellence. Maybe pre-modernist par excellence would be a better way of thinking of him. Yes, so that's interesting. I think another part about this that I wanted to mention in this quote is that he then starts talking about his story as a history. So we not only in this first segment have references to the pastoral romance and the chivalric romance, it's also a history as well. So he's quite conscious of this idea that he's performing deeds that it's the role of the historian to record, placing himself in time and also thinking about how he will become the figure, the central figure of a literary work. Uh, we've got to keep in mind, of course, this is at the process where like the printing revolution has started, but it's also presses around Europe are starting to kick out, to put out written material in quantities that have never been seen before, actually across the world. I mean, even though China had printing long before it comes to Europe, there was no printing revolution per se. And that's for a whole variety of historical reasons we could get into perhaps some other time. But this consciousness of becoming a figure of literature as well. I think there's so much we could explore there. I just don't really perhaps have the faculties to do so in the moment. Tudor, any comments about the segment that I've read?
I think it's interesting. It just ties, I guess, also into, for me, thinking of the social context and how,
Mhm.
in a way, Don Quixote is also aware of the. In a way, he's not aware of, but it's almost as if he's aware of that someone will write about him, and someone is writing about him. That's why we have the story. So yeah, I think
Absolutely.
that, yeah.
No, that's absolutely true. And who is writing about him is a mystery. I think we can only really start getting into maybe around chapter 18 of this part. Chapter 8, chapter 18, I can't remember exactly. But it's in a little while. To use the technical term, the diegetic structure of Don Quixote is bewilderingly complex. We don't know who's actually writing the words right now. Okay, historically we know, of course, it was Miguel de Cervantes, but who Miguel de Cervantes means to be the author is very difficult to tell. Kia, any points you'd like to make? You're scribbling away furiously there, so I'm assuming you've got something interesting to say.
No, it's just a way of listening. I think like having read it, it's like, oh, it's a short chapter. He like goes into the wilderness, he thinks of it, and then he ends up in town, and people make fun of him for this. And it's just like, it's actually quite rich. Like just taking apart small pieces and thinking about what's actually happening. I don't think I've really let myself see how much is in it. So I think I'm just kind of processing that, and then
Well,
maybe back to a different point.
well, likewise, I think for me it's the same. Before we jumped onto this session, I was thinking, yeah, it seems like a fairly simple chapter, but the problem is the moment you start discussing it with other people, you realize it's nothing of the sort. It's actually there's a huge amount we could discuss here, but I think interest in out of the interest of time, but also the fact that perhaps we can't quite fully articulate what we're thinking. We aren't quite able
Mm.
to explore the depths here, but it's very evident to us at this point that there's so much more that's going on than I think any of us initially thought 30 minutes ago, perhaps.
Mm. Yeah,
And
I think
yep, see,
I think like there's a level of intentionality that's quite obvious. Just like talking about how, again, he kind of references himself in the story and quite like a, I don't know what the term is in literature, but there's like that sense of breaking the fourth wall in theater, but like in a literary form, and that like self-referential thing that kind of invites the audience in or the reader in again to like internalize this, which we saw in the last chapter.
yeah,
And that being like kind of a sign that it's like very intentional and that there's a lot at play and how complex this, but yeah, I don't know. Else, yeah, I think we can continue otherwise.
Yes, before we do, one of the things I wanted to mention, I like the fact that you talk about breaking the fourth wall and you bring in theatre as well, because to place this in context, of course, Miguel de Cervantes is writing slap bang in the middle of this prodigious period of artistic flourishing in Spain, the Siglo de Oro, the golden era or golden age. And you can't isolate Don Quixote in that sense. And I think the point that you make about self-referentiality, well, so much of Spanish art is okay. It's actually so much of um, art throughout the Hispanic world, but also especially art throughout a lot of the Latin world. Spain was part of this whole movement, the counter-reform art movement that was particularly strong in Italy and Portugal as well. And one of the recurring themes that we see is this self-referentiality, this mise en abîme that that's really well expressed in Diego de Velázquez's Las Meninas. We brought that picture up last time in our last session, and I actually find it interesting to sort of look at what else is going on in Spanish art at the time to get an idea of what's being communicated in Don Quixote itself. I might as well at this point just quickly throw out a recommendation. This film is extremely difficult to get a hold of, but there's an adaptation of a whole series of novels, modern novels, by an author called Arturo Pérez Reverte. And the film is called Capitán a la Triste, and it narrates the story of Captain, a tercio captain. So that the tercios was this particular pike and shot formation that Spain mastered in during the Spanish, the Crown of Aragon's campaigns in Italy in the 15th century. And the Spanish sort of honed it to perfection. And uh, anyway, in the story, this captain, he's engaged in, well, the story opens up with his campaigns in are today the Netherlands. Of course, that was under the rule of the Holy Roman Empire, and at the time, so the same house that ruled the Holy Roman Empire was also the House of Habsburg, which was ruling Spain for, I'm trying to think, close to 3 centuries, perhaps 2 to 3 centuries. Um, anyway, this film, A la Triste, though its plot is not the best, it's not engaging in terms of plot. I've not found a movie that as succinctly condenses this era aesthetically. If you can ever get a chance, if you ever get a chance, I think um, it may be, you didn't hear this from me, but it may be available online for free on YouTube, if you know how to search for it. It's very difficult to get hold of, but what I really liked about the movie is that it actually it films every shot as if it were a Siglo de Oro painting. So it's got this chiaroscuro tenebrismo kind of color palette. It's replete with references to artists and characters of the time. Miguel de Cervantes might actually even have a cameo in this film. But all the luminaries of the era are there, and it actually gives us this like really engrossing. Um, it's this really engrossing experience, and it gives you the kind of panoply of Spanish art at the time. I'll find it and see if I can't link both of you to it, because even if you can't understand the Spanish, uh, aesthetically it gives you an idea of the world in which Don Quixote was written, and yeah, and relates it, I think, in a sense to what's going on in the rest of the art scene in Spain at the time. Yeah, I think let's continue then. So we've got past the part. We can maybe better follow this using the images that we have. Let me see. I want to try get this. I want this to be enlarged anymore. Maybe I've gone a bit too far. Okay, so here we go. And so we've got Don Quixote through the wilderness, and he basically realizes we're leaving out a few things, but he realizes he's got to find someone to knight him. And but actually, interestingly enough, it's out of hunger that he turns to the inn. out of necessity for rest and out of tiredness and hunger that he turns to the inn. And so we see this man who is very much governed by ideals, by the mind and not the body, um, eventually giving way to the needs of the body, and that's what leads him to the inn. That's not something I thought of just before right now, but that is interesting that we've got this there's this like minute description of details, and at the same time our character is this very abstract thinker. And so we come to the inn here. Comments about as he arrives at the inn. Is there anything either of you would like to say? Nothing in particular.
I
Tito.
think for me, it was quite interesting because then, as he's approaching, you can see he's sort of building up this world.
Yeah.
But when the two women start laughing at him, it's almost I expected in a way for the sort of the world to break,
Mm-hmm.
as if something was going to happen, but it didn't end up
Yeah.
breaking. You know, the
Yeah.
Don Quixote continued. So when he addresses them, he continued in a way of like, even though they're laughing, he continued in a way of addressing as if he was speaking to some ladies, saying he didn't want to upset them, but that he was bothered by their laughing.
Okay, I actually don't remember that bit, but I know, for example, that as he arrives on his horse, they get scared and they start, they kind of
Going inside.
yeah, they try retreat inside. So yeah, that is interesting. He's not at all deterred by others recognizing how ridiculous he looks. He's obstinate in that sense. I think also, again, this how you interpret this part and how you really how you perceive this part depends changes quite considerably depending on whether you think Don Quixote is like entirely convinced by his deception, or if he is uh, actually somewhat self-aware. This ties into a dynamic, right? The what you're talking about here is this dynamic that's in Don Quixote, but it's in a lot of Siglo de Oro literature. Engaño, desengaño, so deceit and kind of the scales falling away from your eyes. Engaño, deceit, desengaño, undeceit, literally. So we can see here that though these women laughing at Don Quixote promises desengaño, he remains fully engañado, right? Perhaps. Perhaps, depending on your understanding of Don Quixote's psyche. This is one of the interesting parts. Okay, so of course I assume, I mean, we're not monetized, so I assume I can say this, but because you know, in terms of potentially explicit language, but of course these two women are prostitutes or whores, right? So, and he sees them as ladies. I wonder sometimes if with Don Quixote, and this will maybe become we can maybe answer this question more clearly in as we go on. Does his willingness to always see the best in people actually lead to them changing the way they behave, changing how, or not necessarily changing the way they behave, more changing how they perceive of themselves and how they feel about themselves? I've always wondered if there's this sense in which like by looking at people who would kind of and the innkeeper is the same. So the innkeeper himself will see, as is stated, he's actually he's somewhat of a ruffian. He's well acquainted with the underground in Andalusia, actually in Seville, right? Um, in fact, Seville is an important city. It's a symbolic city throughout all of Don Quixote. If we think about quickly the geography of Spain, Madrid, which is in the region of Castilla, and La Mancha as well, those are both like central to Spain. And in symbolic terms, they kind of represent centrality, as it were. Uh, it's where the seat of the government is. certainly in modern Spain. At the time Don Quixote was written, Spain had an itinerary court, but it was always considered kind of like it was actually established. Madrid was actually established, um, was chosen as the center of the government on a number of occasions, largely because it's literally in the center of the country. So it's symbolically it's the center. Um, but then Sevilla, so the region of Andalusia, is in the south. And so whenever in a lot of Cervantes's works, whenever you hear about someone coming from Sevilla, or more common, going down to Sevilla, that's also got almost like it's got kind of cosmological significance. So there's the sign that they're kind of entering down into the very nitty gritty, the sordid elements of society. Sevilla is not, or Seville in English, is not actually a port city, but it is the city in which a lot of what was coming into Spain through its southern ports was processed. And of course, so it's interacting literally with the margins of Spain. It's interacting with all these unknown elements. Um, it's interacting with things that in a sense need to be processed before they can be integrated into the centrality of Spain. And so both of these characters, you can actually see here, they say, at the door were standing two young women, girls of the district, as they call them. So we can see Cervantes' euphemism, on their way to Seville with some carriers who had chanced to halt that night at the inn. So we can see there's this literal kind of going down in society. Um, the innkeeper, I don't know if they actually give his name. The innkeeper whom Don Quixote uh, obstinately refers to as Señor Castellan. There's a funny pun there, but we'll get there soon. Señor Castellan also actually comes from the Sevillan underground. So it's interesting that Don Quixote is looking at these people who in Cervantes deliberately wrote to kind of represent like the most kind of sordid component elements of society. Don Quixote's willingness to see this nobility in them, even I wonder if that's kind of something that as we go on we'll see actually changes how people think of themselves. I don't think it's too much the case thus far in this chapter, but certainly with the two women, I think you can see almost a change in how they conceive of who they are. Not so much the innkeeper. The innkeeper is quite obstinate, and it's very clear that he's kind of making fun of Cervantes. He takes this kind of deep joy in humiliating Don Quixote. Sorry, not Cervantes. Um, so that's actually my point. Is I think something I'd like us to keep in mind as we go on is uh, how does the way Don Quixote perceives other people, the way he kind of ennobles them in his vision, changes how they perceive themselves. Doesn't necessarily mean that they perceive themselves more positively, but that's something I always wonder about. Any comments on that?
Um,
Yeah,
do
maybe
you want to go?
Let's have Kier first, and then Tudor, you can go afterwards.
Okay. I think I think yeah, I feel bad because I'm probably gonna read too much of Plato into this, and I know it's Neoplatonic. But there's this idea of the good, when you're kind of reading into Plato and what like the good is in other people, although very, very roughly speaking, because there's the sense that you don't know what the good is, but that to be a good person is to see the world in its best potential.
Mm-hmm.
And this idea that he's got this idea of the good, and when he sees these people in the best potential, he treats them as if they were their best potential. And I guess like there is this natural response to that. So yeah, I think that is what's happening, and I also thought that was what was happening when I was reading it. I'm not sure about the innkeeper because there is like a feeling later on that he kind of, although it is mocking, that he's like kind of taking Don Quixote under his wing and being like, like the man that he see like he's like he wants to be a knight, and there's this process of being what's it called? Before you're a knight, you're a
Is it a squire? Am I
yes,
incorrect? Yes.
yes.
Okay. Yes.
So like there's the sense that he's like being squired by this person that he wants to knight him because he's getting advice from him. So there's like even a sense there that this is what's happening as well. So I mean, I think there's a greater level of mockery there, but still it's like there a little bit.
Interesting.
But yeah, I think it is interesting.
No, that's a good point. I think I'll have to reevaluate the Señor Castellan innkeeper. Um, Before I hand over to Tudor, so just to explain that joke, of course, Castellan in Spanish could mean the custodian of a castle, but also it could mean Castellano is someone who is from the region of Castile, central Spain. Of course, we remember that Spanish history, more or less from 711 up until 1492, and actually, frankly speaking, for quite a while afterwards, is really a union of distinct kingdoms, and the kingdom of Castile is the one that achieves hegemony amidst all of the others. So, so in a sense, in fact, actually, the region Castile itself is named after the castles on its frontiers. And so when Don Quixote refers to the innkeeper as the Castellan, Señor Castellan, he means, custodian of the castle. Uh, the innkeeper interprets Señor Castellan as Don Quixote saying, you are a Castilian, you're from this particular region. And the innkeeper finds that funny because, of course, the innkeeper knows that he is an Andalusian. So that's kind of the pun that the wordplay that Cervantes inserts in here. Tudor, on the subject of Don Quixote reading the best into others and how they react, do you have any comments about this, about how he in his own mind ennobles the innkeeper and the two women?
I think what's interesting is that, like you say, they in a way were mocking him, but at the same time, they did end up serving him and putting up with him, so specifically with this idea of him being very stubborn and not wanting to remove his helmet. And it creates sort of this visual of someone struggling in a way to eat. Like it would be impossible for him to do it on his own. They do end up being the ones to help him do it. And I think it's interesting because it's the way they're described, also in like the narrative of like the innkeeper being someone who's like has a history of being someone involved in like gangs and knowing how to steal things and take advantage of people. Then he's the one who like ends up helping him. And then same for the woman, in a way of seeing sort of people that would they live off of getting paid in order to do something for people, end up like helping this crazy old man eat food. Yeah.
That's actually a really interesting point. I never thought of that at all. That's really fascinating because at no point, well, until the next chapter, do we even see any example of exchange of money for services. And even then, in the next chapter, it's actually not for the service of being taken care of in the inn. This also brings something else. Is this the very kind of like the extreme? I'm trying to think of a really good term of this, but how basic the the human actions are in the scene. So this is the first time we actually see Don Quixote eat or drink. I'm pretty sure. This is actually the first time we see him do this. There's this really, again, there's this kind of there's this strong mythological style to these first two chapters. We mentioned the components earlier on, but then also him fulfilling the needs of being a human being, actually eating and drinking in order to sustain his own life. But then also this interesting idea that he needs society in order to do that. That's also really fascinating. Something else that you brought out there, Tudor, I thought was interesting is the dominance of ritual, right? So even though these people aren't like, they don't hold the same beliefs as Don Quixote, the necessity of life and the necessity of social interaction actually means that they engage in this ubiquitous ritual of feeding and eating and drinking. We don't see them eat or drink, of course, but kind of, but I think you get the point. That action is taking place, and in a sense, almost regardless of their lack of belief, they end up treating him as if he were a knight or a squire. That was maybe to your point earlier, Kia. That's something really interesting. I think there's a very interesting. This is a very general historical observation that I'm going to make, but there's a very interesting uh, lecturer and researcher in cognitive science and cognitive psychology, John Vervaeke. He's got a whole series of lectures on YouTube, um, and in one of his series he examines the history of cognition and human cognition and cognitive philosophy in globally, but with a specific focus on the West. One of the points that he makes is that after Descartes, we tend to adopt this idea that what makes one that kind of that in a sense the basis of all of our social interactions are our beliefs, and he links this to the highly politicized environment. He's from Canada, and so he links this to the highly politicized environment and what would the word be? Polarized as well. Uh, Environment predominant in the United States and in Canada. Something actually, fortunately, I think in South Africa we don't experience too much of. But his point there is that that's an example of what happens when we assume that the basis of all of our actions is what are our beliefs or the propositions that we can expound in writing and in speech. Uh, Whereas, but in reality, there's actually a whole slew of other things that inform how we interact, and that's actually this is an interesting example of that. These people don't. No one here, the two parties here, don't share the same beliefs, but they actually end up sort of helping each other actually in a way. Because also that not only is are they helping Don Quixote in a way? Don Quixote is giving them something to to kind of he's giving them like a ritual they can participate in. You know, that's something that actually just struck me right now. I don't know if either of you have any comments on that.
I don't have comments on that exactly. I had comments on this image from earlier. So I don't know if Tudor wants to maybe jump in on that first or um
Yeah, Tudor.
okay. Yeah, I think there was this interesting thing about the fact that they feed him,
Yeah,
and that the thing that's getting in the way of him feeding himself is this helmet that he refuses to take off, because
interesting. Yeah,
he's like, he's not wearing any other armor except the helmet, which is tied on by this ribbon. And if this ribbon gets cut, he has no way else to keep on this helmet. So it's like a very important part of this whole kind of narrative that he's got going here, that he's this dignified knight. And while being this dignified knight, genuinely looks ridiculous. And that kind of comparison. But I think what you were saying earlier, that what draws him to the inn is not actually that he wants to be knighted and like these ideal things, but that he wants to be fed. And then again, having that kind of turned around by his ideals kind of literally getting in the way of his like physical needs.
yeah,
And like that I guess pull in that image, and like the symbolism of like the reality of this is a man who um, needs to be fed but is refusing to feed himself for his ideals, and then this dignified knight that's not dignified at all. So I don't know, I think that was kind of just the
yeah.
beginning of that chapter to the end of the well, mid chapter to the end of the chapter, kind of linking up really nicely on that kind of level.
No, that's a great observation. I think that's a superb observation. It's that helmet is symbolic. I like this word. I'll be using it often, but in often when we use the word symbol, we use it in the sense of one thing standing for something else that's completely different. I've been doing a lot of research into medieval ideas of what a symbol was and early modern ideas of what a symbol was. And they were a lot more what we might consider etymologically accurate. Symbol comes from the two Greek words sum and bolein. And sum means together, so we can think about being sympathetic, sharing the same emotions, sympathos, right? Uh,
Mm.
and bolein means to throw. So a parabolic arc is actually literally shows how a ball is thrown, right?
Mm.
Um, hyperbole is literally to throw over. So this word symbol is when a whole bunch of different things are thrown together in one, and the thing that they constitute in one is it's constitutive. It like literally does what it looks like it's doing. You know, it's kind of almost all things at once. It's when there's no distinction between name and thing. Um, and we see this the whole time in Don Quixote. I think it's a very useful way of trying to understand Don Quixote, kind of in its depth and kind of the meat of Don Quixote is looking at it symbolically. And you're absolutely right that that helmet is a perfect symbol because it represents. I mean, even you wear it on your head. The head is often a symbol of, well, the brain is the symbol often of the intellect, right? And so there's this point where his intellect is getting in the way of him actually functioning as a human being, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah, I thought that's actually that's why I like your point there, particular. Tudor, did you have anything you wanted to add in there?
Not really, but it's really interesting looking at some. Yeah.
Well, it's been awesome discussing this with you. I think uh, really we could probably go on for much longer, but we've chronologically come to the end of this chapter. I think next time we'll look at chapter 3 and continue taking everything that we've observed here further. Are there any parting remarks either of you would like to make?
Uh, no, this is great. I'm really excited for next chapter.
Yeah, and thank you very much for all of your contribution. Tudor, anything you'd like to mention before we finish off?
I think it's interesting already looking at what's happened in this chapter to see further interactions with people. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking forward to it enormously as well. It's been wonderful. Thank you both for your time. And thank you everyone who is watching for listening to this video. I hope that you were all able to follow along with your own reading. And to Tudor and Kia and to everyone, I will say muchas gracias y hasta la próxima. Adiós. Okay, I think, let me check. Have I paused the recording yet? No. I hadn't yet. I'll just get that edited out at the. No, in fact, actually, I haven't even paused the recording. I'll ask Lesedi just to change that up because I wasn't able quite to